Some of these builds I can't even believe are allowed to exist, and other ones came out of basically nowhere. But what's absolutely certain is that plenty of these are really busted builds, and you should take advantage of them. Snap, crackle, and pop the like and sub buttons out of the way, and let's jump right in. The first champion we're going to cover is Ezreal, and Ezreal is a really popular champion, so what's changed? First up, nobody is taking anything but Conqueror, and they're backing that up with Presence of Mind, Bloodline, Coup de Grace, or Cut Down if the enemy team is going to have a lot of high health targets, and Biscuits and Cosmic Insight. This allows Ezreal to have a respectable early game, abusing the attack speed that's already existing in his passive, while still scaling really heavily. Presence of Mind, Bloodline, and Cut Down are all really good scaling runes, and so is Cosmic Insight. For the most part, these high elo players are taking Flash and Heal, however they do sometimes take Teleport, but that's nothing new. And neither is the attack speed adaptive and armor in the minor runes, so what is it? Well, obviously it's gotta be in the items, and the key here is that they're still trying to rush the Manamune, and yes, it's pronounced Manamune. You can clearly see the references to the Japanese Muramasa and Masamune. Now, feel free to call me a weeb in the comments if you want, but that's not going to stop me from covering the rest of the build, which will of course go Triforce any chance you can, and if you have to, you go Iceborne Gauntlet, but then they always go Lucidity Boots. And this is because, no matter what goes on, they are always buying a Death Stance as their fourth item. This gives them a really big spike, because right around the point where they're completing the lifesteal components or even the full Death Stance, they now have 40% CDR, they have their Muramana, they have all their damage items, and they are hitting like an absolute monster. You don't have to give up Cosmic Insight in order to take Transcendence to hit that 40% CDR mark. And that means that you'll also have 45% because you have the rune. But the most important thing is that this turns Ezreal into almost a bruiser in terms of how hard he is to kill. The bleed, on top of the fact that he has Omnivamp, is insanely powerful. All of Ezreal's damage, besides his ultimate, is single target, which means he's going to be healing a ton no matter who he's hitting. Throw in the Bloodline lifesteal, and then also add on top of that the Conqueror steal, and you could see why I called him effectively a bruiser. When you hit 4 items as Ezreal at this point, you should be unstoppable unless you're making mistakes. The build even addresses Ezreal's weaknesses to tanky champions and people with high CC by taking Cut Down or even buying a Blade of the Ruined King. And if you really needed a last item to deal with CC, you could always buy a Mercurial Scimitar for the QSS effect, or if not, buy a Mortal Reminder to stop people from healing and shred through more armor. The lesson from this build is that we need to be seriously careful and watch out for people building Death Stance on 80 carries in the future, because it's going to be insanely broken on anybody that it can even remotely work on. With Ezreal wrapped up, let's talk about Senna, as Senna is a champion who is mostly played as a support. Sometimes she's played as AD carry, and by far, Fasting Senna is the strongest form of Senna. This build is a new form of Fasting Senna that focuses on her as a support, and it is absolutely disgusting. And beyond that, it's so sad to see somebody like Senna have more health than like tank junglers and not die. And you accomplish this partially by taking Grasp as your keystone rune. And for your primary runes, because you have so much health, Font of Life is amazing for you. And you take Bone Plating for a bit of extra tankiness and Revitalize for the extra healing, with your secondary runes being Presence of Mind and Legend Alacrity. And I will say that the Alacrity is kind of a head scratcher because Senna doesn't really benefit from attack speed, and I wouldn't be surprised if this changed within the next weeks as people experimented with this build more and more. And the same thing applies to the fact that her minor runes include the attack speed rune, the adaptive rune, and the armor rune. This build also has really great flexibility in the summoner spells because Senna can take either Barrier, Heal, or Exhaust along with Flash. If you're playing with an Ezreal AD carry and he takes Teleport, you could take Heal. If your AD carry takes Heal, you could take Barrier, or if you notice that the enemy has one person who's a really big threat, you could take Exhaust. But the thing that's most important is that you start your build off with a Spectral Sickle and then immediately rush a Frozen Mallet. You guys are probably wondering, isn't Glacial Augment just so broken on Senna? And yeah, you're right, it is. But what if you just had it in an item that also gave you 700 health and attack damage? Sounds pretty good to me. And that's exactly what this build does. It turns Glacial Augment Senna into a one item spike Glacial Augment Senna that also becomes way harder to kill because you just have such a fat health bar that nobody can really do that to you. And the memes don't stop there. You're gonna pull up that Swifties, as Senna most often still buys right now, but then go a Black Cleaver for the armor shred, the cooldown reduction, the health, and the attack damage, and you could kinda see a trend going there. By this point, you're well beyond 2000 health, and as you level, things only get more and more disgusting. Every Grasp proc gives you 3 HP, And as you go into the later stages of the game where you're still buying things like Duskblade and Edge of Night, or even something like Umbral Sickle, you still have a ton of utility and the ability to deal good damage. This build allows Senna to basically not care about her one weakness, which is people diving directly on top of her. It's almost impossible for an assassin to kill somebody who just has that much raw health. It doesn't matter how little armor they actually have. And while that changes as the game goes on and people start to scale more, that doesn't mean Senna stops scaling there, and that's exactly why it's basically impossible to deal with her with this build. Next up, we've got somebody who ruled the top lane for a really long time, and now, with a recent rune change, they're coming back. We see players in high elo Korea switching pretty quickly to resolve secondary in their runes on Darius. So they're taking Conqueror, Triumph, Tenacity, and Last Stand still, but they're going Second Wind and Unflinching with attack speed, adaptive, and armor. And just in case you guys don't know what the new Unflinching does, it gives you Tenacity all the time, and the Tenacity scales with your missing health. It also gives you the same amount in slow resistance, and it scales the same way. Darius players are willing to sacrifice all the extra movement speed they get from Nimbus Cloak and Celerity, and instead just have this tenacity and slow resist that Unflinching offers at all points. This also does stem from the buffs that Riot just made to Ghost as well, which makes Darius less reliant on the Nimbus Cloak in the first place. And because Darius is a champion who can have super huge swings of health thanks to his Q, this Unflinching rune is super high value for him. The item build that players are taking hasn't changed just yet, and it's kinda obvious to see why. They still go Triforce first, as it is an amazing item for Darius, and then they either decide between Tabbies or Swifties, because they no longer need Merc Tread since they have free Tenacity from Legend Tenacity and Unflinching. Then they still go Sterix, despite having the Tenacity, because really Sterix is useful for the health shield that it gives, as it buys Darius a bunch of time to be able to get that Q off that he needs to restore, 40% of his maximum health if he hits several people. After that, you're looking at Deadman, Spear Visage, and a last item Death Stance, which is nothing particularly new, but the rune build is definitely new, and that really addresses one of Darius's main weaknesses, which is kiting and CC. Slow resist and tenacity in a rune sounds pretty damn good for the champion. While this setup definitely doesn't make him stronger when he's already in a good scenario, what it does do is reduce the areas where he's weakened, and that can really have a big impact on the performance of a champion. But of course, that's assuming that you know how to play the champion in those scenarios and know what's going to stop you from being able to kill the entire enemy team. That sort of in-depth champion-specific information is what we can give you guys on our website, GameLeap.com. All of our guides are done by challenger level players, and they range from champion-specific guides like ones on Darius to macro guides on how to play the game and move around the map. No matter what skill you're trying to learn or improve at, we have a video up there for you, and it's the best place for you to go in order to learn and improve and start stomping your games. With Darius covered, I have a little bit of a disclaimer before we move on to our next build, which focuses on Malphite. And this one isn't really a Korean build, but it kinda is depending on how you justify it. You see, this build is done by Someday. He's the top laner for 100 Thieves, and he's from Korea. I did also find one other high elo Korean player who sometimes uses this build, but that'd be totally misleading for me to call it a Korean build when it's really not used by any of the other Malphite players there. This build is just so unique and interesting that I have to tell you guys about it. It takes Press the Attack with Presence of Mind, Alacrity, Coup de Grace, Biscuits, and Time Warp Tonic with attack speed and double armor in your minor runes, and Flash Teleport as you are a top laner. This build, of the runes alone, turns Malphite into somebody who normally wants to take short trades and abuse his shields and other things to really win those short trades, and then makes him into somebody who can actually stick it out and say, yeah, I want to start beating up a bruiser, I want to right-click people. And the item build starts out relatively normal, but there's a couple sneaky things that find their way in there. First off, it's important to say that this is mostly picked by Someday and the other person who I saw using it into really specific bruiser matchups who focus on auto-attacking a lot or having sustain and lifesteal. Champions like Jax, Fiora, and Wukong are good examples of this. This is why, every single time, without failure, these guys rush Bramble Vest and then go into a Sunfire Cape and then a Tabby. They're playing into Malphite's strengths, they're buying armor, they're taking double armor in the minor runes, they're going all in on destroying a physical damage right clicker. After that, if they find they're taking a bunch of magic damage, they'll go Abyssal Mask, but the preferred item is actually going Triforce second. Having all that armor on top of a Triforce makes Malphite an actually really threatening 1v1er. He's got high attack speed, he's got good base damage for Triforce Sheen procs, he's got good movement speed, as if he didn't already with this Q, but he's also got Phage now on top of that. He's got high cooldown reduction for all of his abilities, which are very impactful, including his ultimate. His lack of mana is addressed by the Sheen part of the Triforce, and when I put it that way, it actually seems pretty hard to ignore. From there, it's all about addressing what resistances you want to finish out the game. You could finish your Thornmail if you want more armor, you could finish the Abyssal Mask that I mentioned earlier, or you could even go on Adaptive Helm if you feel like you need that reduction on damage over time. And hey, all the above would make a pretty solid build, giving you 40% cooldown reduction as well as really good tankiness. But enough about Mr. Malphite, let's talk about something else. And that something else is gonna be Bard, because a couple things about Bard got buffed indirectly. The Guardian change really makes Bard a lot better now, because it's a lot easier to keep your shield for when you actually need it, and the shield is also more powerful. Bard himself doesn't need the movement speed that Guardian used to give that much, as he already has plenty. He has movement speed in his chimes, movement speed in his W, and mobility in his E. And because of the shifting meta, Bard, despite being nerfed, is doing really well right now. We see a lot of Bard players in Korea moving away from Electrocute, Omnistone, and other styles of playing Bard and more towards the Guardian because it's so buffed now. They take Guardian with Font of Life, Bone Plating, Revitalize, Zombie Ward, and Relentless Hunter, with attack speed adaptive and armor in their minor runes, with Flash Ignite or Exhaust depending on their matchup. And with more of a focus on defense, these guys are also buying Relic Shield first, rather than Spell Thieves, as they prefer the health and the ability power to the more ability power. From there, most of them are picking up Moby Boots for the absolute roaming power that gives. However, Swifties is a really good option if you still want to be able to roam, but also are focusing on kiting the enemy team, because they all have champions who try and dive and walk at you. Again, I will say this, that this Bard build is more focused on defense and lasting longer than your opponents ever can. And so making it so that you're not in the fight and are constantly making it super hard for your opponents to hit you will make you last a lot longer. After that, the build gets kinda standard but has some switch ups. You go for Athene's into Redemption for the absolute support power that gives. You have a ton of damage and you also have great healing because of the Athenes, and Magic Resist, with even more coming in from Redemption. Then the build takes a step back and takes a part of what other Bard defensive builds have been in the past, where they get a Dead Man's now. They get some kind of movement speed focused item that is very defensive. Here it could be a Dead Man's, which is the most often seen option, but you could go something like a Shirelia's as well. And then in your last slot, you're looking for a defensive item that also gives you cooldown reduction. If you happen to go Shirelia's, you only need 10% more to reach 40%, and that's pretty easy to do. You could buy a Zanya's, you could buy a Zeke's. There's a lot of options that can give you 10% cooldown reduction that Bard can use pretty effectively. But even if you don't and you opt for the Dead Man's, you still have plenty of options too. Frozen Heart is an amazing defensive item that gives Bard 20% cooldown reduction. You could even go a Frozen Gauntlet, which Bard does actually use pretty well. It'll be really interesting to see where Bard ends up on this patch, especially with the buffed Guardian and this new sort of intermixing of two different playstyles. Focusing on early game supporting while still being defensive, and then getting really tanky into the later stages of the game. But Bard is now wrapped up, and we could talk about Draven. And this champion has had a pretty standard build. People have gone Hail of Blades, they get the Muramana build, it's whatever. But when I tell you that everything about that build in terms of the runes got flipped upside down, I mean it literally. Hail of Blades and Lethal Tempo are complete polar opposites. They do the exact same thing at the exact opposite times. Hob is all about the fast, quick, short trades where you get multiple auto attacks in. Lethal Tempo is about the long, extended trades where you get a ton in because you get ramped up and start going absolutely crazy. It seems like Draven players in Korea have realized that it's better suited towards Draven's goal. Sure, Hail of Blades might help you get in some cheesy stuff in the early game, but does it really help you do what you want to do? Does it feel good in teamfights? Does it actually do something meaningful other than allow you to snowball a little bit? And the answer is no, it really doesn't. And Lethal Tempo does do something for you. It lets you shred through people really quickly, especially in the fights where Draven can struggle because he can't DPS down somebody who's tanky. Once Hail of Blades ran out, you just felt like you had nothing left. This build takes Lethal Tempo, obviously, with Presence of Mind, Bloodline, Last Stand, or Cut Down depending on the enemy team composition, and Magical Footwear in Futures Market, with attack speed, adaptive, and armor in your minor runes, and Flash Heal taken almost every single time. The build focuses on getting the important buys for Draven, mostly getting that Manamune in the early game. What you have to do in order to actually be effective on Draven is you need to buy the pickaxe first, not the tier, and then hope that you have enough gold to buy the Manamune on a back. Futures Market addresses that problem in areas where Draven just can't stick around anymore, and everything else is pretty much dedicated to scaling, from Presence of Mind to Bloodline to Last Stand or Cutdown and Lethal Tempo itself. Even the magical footwear is just more free gold for Draven and more utility for him to kite with. The item build here though, as you might have guessed, doesn't really change. You go Manamune first item into Sanguine Blade and then Edge of Night, with tabbies because you really don't have any luxuries to buy Merc Treads. We also noticed that none of the Draven players we looked at went Berserker Greaves ever, and there has to be a reason for that. That's not a coincidence. After their boots, they went Mortal Reminder, as you might have been able to guess, as they do need armor penetration somewhere, and the cutting lifesteal is just a bonus at that point. Lastly, Guardian Angel wrapped up many people's builds, although we did occasionally see a Death Stance. And I talked about it earlier with Ezreal, and I'm gonna say it again here, Riot needs to be watching out because Death Dance is becoming way too good on AD carries. People are just now realizing that the item is actually insanely shattered. They basically just made all AD carries, aside from like Kai'Sa and Ezreal, who are already pretty hard to kill, into bruisers, basically, in terms of their actual durability. But let's move on to Camille, as she's a champion who's very strong if you know how to play her. Her main weakness is in the very early game where she can be abused in certain matchups or outplayed. But something that seems to be removing that ability to outplay is this new rune setup on Camille. A lot of the high elo players in Korea are choosing to go Grasp with Shield Bash, Bone Plating, Unflinching, Mana Flow, and Transcendence with double adaptive and armor. And of course, as top laners, they're taking Teleport, and also Flash. I'm not leaving anything up to chance. I'm not saying you said I didn't say what other summoner they use and you guys are taking Ignite in your games with Teleport for some reason and then you blaming me. None of that. But what does the rune setup do exactly? Well, when Camille is farming, it allows her to have a really good pattern of trading. If you stack up your Grasp properly and use your Q and W appropriately, you can actually get 2 Grasp procs off in a single trade without ever using your E. And this allows you to save your E for defensive purposes if you're getting ganked. The extra damage and sustain from Grasp will also help you as you go throughout the laning phase. The same applies to Shield Bash and Bone Plating, as well as Unflinching, which offers you the tenacity and slow resist that Camille needs as she goes into the game. With these new runes, it also comes with a change in items. You still want to go Triforce first. It's an amazing item on Camille, there's really no replacement for it. It has way too many synergies with her entire kit. But what tends to happen is that players are ignoring Merc Treads entirely and going tabbies every game since they have Unflinching. And beyond that, they also get to go Ravenous Hydra without worrying about getting CC'd and not being able to lifesteal because they already have tenacity. The slow resistance really is just a bonus, but getting it for free and having a strong rune setup for early game is amazing. And they even delay defensive items for one more Death Stance buy, which you could argue is defensive, but really its main purpose is to allow you to smash people over and over again and lifesteal through any damage that you're taking. Once you finish your Death Stance and you're looking at your last 2 item slots, then we see players begin to pick up Sterix, and that's because the Sterix shield is really good. But with the amount of bonus health that Camille has, the Sterix shield is actually smaller than a Phantom Dancer shield. The only difference is the lack of tenacity and the fact that the stats are also different. Attack speed and crit versus AD. We've seen players run both and they've even opted to ignore them entirely, going for more defensive options or utility-based options. Things that offer pure defense, like Randuin's, even a Deadman's, perhaps a Spirit Visage for synergy with their lifesteal. But the one thing that is stable is getting a GA as a last item, and this makes sense. It frees up Camille to engage and fight in ways that she couldn't before. This is one of those builds that, just like Darius, we're interested to see how it evolves over the patch and into the future, because we don't know what people are going to experiment with now that they have all this free tenacity and slow resist. Who knows, maybe Camille and Darius players now all buy Swifties basically every game. We'll have to see, but now let's move on to our last champion, and it's going to be Poppy. This one isn't going to take too much time because the only thing that's changed here is the runes, and we've gone over the item build several times before actually. You see, this is a Poppy jungle build, and we've seen Predator Poppy with Moby Boots and Deadman's, we've seen Halo Blades Poppy with defensive boots and Deadman's, and now we're seeing Phase Rush Poppy with defensive boots and Deadman's. To complement the Phase Rush, you're going Nimbus Cloak with Celerity and Water Walking and taking Hex Flash and Cosmic Insight, which is kind of like the set idea, where you use the Nimbus Cloak movement speed in order to go over walls or just close distance and get a gank off on the enemy laner. It definitely allows for some very unique ganks like Hex Flashing over the enemy Raptor wall or something like that, and also has a lot of utility in the later stages of the game too. The scaling is also there, as the Phased Rush mobility in the middle of a teamfight can allow Poppy to reposition with her W and block people from dashing onto key targets, or just get away if she's in danger of being CC locked and killed. And of course, you always have the option of using the phase rush movement speed to chase somebody down. Don't forget to take double adaptive and armor in your minor runes. The attack speed is not worth it on Poppy because her Q cooldown is so low and so good at clearing jungle camps. And of course, Flash and Smite should be your summoner spells. I mean, if you were taking anything other than Flash with Hex Flash, I think that's probably a reportable offense. But for the build, like I said, it's just what it was in the past. You buy a Stalking Cinderhulk for the blue Smite that has synergy with Nimbus Cloak. And from there, you go defensive boots, either Tabby or Merc Treads depending on the enemy team, and then a Deadman's, as the movement speed and the slow from the auto attack is great utility. From there, Stone Plate into Locket is great for shielding and tankiness for your whole team, and then lastly, whatever magic resist or resistance item you need. In this case, we go for an Adaptive Helm so that you're well-rounded in your armor and magic resist. And with that, that's all the Korean builds we have for 10.12. To find more guides that get to go way more in depth than something like this, you should go check out our website GameLeap.com. Whether you're looking for champion itemization and rune choices like this whole video is dedicated to, or other things like macro, lane-specific tips, or even just replays and VOD reviews of really good professional and challenger level players, we have everything. And we don't just look at challenger level players, all of our videos are made by challenger level players, the best of the best, so they know exactly what they're talking about and exactly what they're looking at to explain to you and to teach you. And if you made it this far, thanks for watching the whole video. Some of the builds this patch have just got me tearing my hair out because it's so silly that they can even exist and function the way that they do. Like, this sort of thing should be outlawed, where an Ezreal is harder to kill than a 6-item Jax that has 3 tank items. It just doesn't make any sense. Let me know what you guys think about the Frozen Mallet Senna and Death Dance Ezreal in the comments. And anyways, as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.